This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The jury was out for 6 hours and 41 minutes, and Teodora spent every one of them sitting beside Renata in the small conference room, watching the clock hand move with the specific, agonizing slowness of a woman who had spent her entire career believing evidence spoke for itself, and was now learning, the hard way, that 12 strangers could take as long as they wanted to decide whether they agreed. "Whatever happens," Renata said quietly, somewhere around the 4th hour, "you did the right thing, telling them everything. I need you to hold on to that, no matter what they come back with. Tell that to my career. Your career isn't what's on trial anymore. You made sure of that yourself." Renata's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever watched a client do, or the single worst piece of legal strategy in the history of this courthouse. I genuinely can't decide which." "Can it be both?" "It's usually both," Renata said, and that was when the bailiff knocked. The courtroom had never felt smaller than it did walking back in, every seat filled, every reporter's pen poised, Cesare's eyes finding hers the instant she crossed the threshold, and holding on with an intensity that made the 12 strangers in the jury box feel, for one absurd moment, entirely beside the point. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman rose. Teodora realized she wasn't breathing. "On the charge of evidence tampering in the 2nd degree. Guilty." A ripple went through the gallery. Teodora felt the word land in her chest like something physical, and made herself keep her spine straight, the way her mother had taught her at funerals. "On the charge of obstruction of justice." The foreman paused, and it was the longest pause of Teodora's entire life. "Not guilty. On the finding that the defendant acted to prevent a documented and provable miscarriage of justice, and that the evidence she altered was itself the product of criminal fabrication by a third party." It took Teodora a full 3 seconds to understand what she had just heard. Guilty of the lesser charge. Acquitted of the one that would have meant real prison time. The one built entirely on the premise that she had helped a guilty man escape justice rather than helped an innocent one survive a conspiracy against him. The gallery erupted. The judge's gavel came down 3 times before the noise settled enough for him to speak. "In light of the jury's finding, and given the extraordinary circumstances entered into evidence regarding the fabrication of the original case, this court sentences the defendant to 18 months suspended with 3 years probation and permanent revocation of her forensic licensing, pending review." He looked at her over his glasses, something almost like respect flickering behind the exhaustion. "Dr. Marchi, this court recognizes that you broke the law. It also recognizes, with some discomfort, that you may have done more to serve justice by breaking it than most people in this room manage by following it. That is not a compliment, it is an observation. Court is adjourned." She did not remember standing. She remembered only Cesare's arms around her, half a second before the bailiffs could separate them for processing. His mouth against her hair, his voice rough with something that sounded, for the first time in 6 months, almost like relief instead of dread. "You're free," he said. "I'm on probation. I've lost my license." "I'm not free, Cesare. "You're not in a cell," he said, pulling back just far enough to look at her, his hands framing her face like she was something he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to hold. Everything else we rebuild, that part I can promise you. It was only later, in the chaos of reporters and cameras, and Renata physically inserting herself between them and the nearest microphone, that Teodora understood the trial had never actually been the end of anything. Dario was still free, his name barely mentioned in 6 months of proceedings that had focused almost entirely on Cesare's guilt or innocence, rather than the architect who'd engineered the whole conspiracy. Elena was still hiding, her testimony given in a sealed deposition rather than open court, her safety still entirely dependent on a secret that a courtroom full of reporters had just spent an afternoon speculating about in explicit, dangerous detail. And somewhere across the city, in an office with a view he had spent 40 years believing he deserved, Dario Vitale was almost certainly watching the verdict on television, recalculating. Exactly the way he always recalculated how to survive what came next. The verdict had answered one question. It had opened a dozen more dangerous ones in its place, and Teodora, standing in the wreckage of her old career, held tightly by a man the world still couldn't decide whether to fear or forgive, understood that the real war, the one that would determine whether either of them got to keep the life they'd fought so hard to protect, was only just beginning. She thought, standing in the crush of reporters afterward, about the version of herself who had walked into that courtroom for the first time 6 months earlier, certain that telling the truth would be enough on its own to save her, as though honesty were a kind of armor rather than simply a choice that came with its own separate set of consequences. That woman had not understood yet that a verdict could be both a victory and a wound at the same time, that a jury could believe her completely and still, correctly, according to the letter of the law, find her guilty of the thing she had actually done. She understood it now, standing on the courthouse steps with Cesare's hand wrapped tightly around hers, cameras flashing in a rhythm that felt less like scrutiny and more, strangely, like punctuation on a sentence that had finally, after 6 unbearable months, reached its end. "They're going to want a statement," Renata said, appearing at her elbow with the harried efficiency of a lawyer who had spent the last hour fending off 3 separate networks. "You don't have to give one. You've already given this courtroom more truth than most defendants give in a lifetime." "I know," Teodora said. "I think for once I'd actually like to say nothing at all." She looked at Cesare, and something passed between them that needed no translation for the cameras to understand exactly what it meant. "Let them speculate. I've spent 6 months being honest with people who demanded it of me under oath. I think I've earned the right to keep the rest of this for myself." They gave her 48 hours before the federal prosecutor's office called, and Teodora spent every one of them in Cesare's penthouse, unable to sleep more than an hour at a stretch, watching the news cycle chew through her name with a hunger that felt almost personal. "They want Elena," Renata said, setting her phone face down on the kitchen counter like it had personally offended her. A sealed deposition isn't enough for the federal case they're trying to build against Dario. They need her on record, in person, willing to testify to a grand jury about the embezzlement, the staged death, all of it. Without her, everything you gave them about the conspiracy is second-hand, compelling, but not enough to indict a man with Dario's resources and his lawyers. "She's been hiding for over a year to stay alive," Teodora said. "You're asking me to convince her to walk into the exact danger she ran from." I'm not asking you to convince her of anything. Renata's voice softened, just slightly. I'm telling you what the prosecutor told me. Your probation, your license review, all of it stays exactly where it is. A guilty verdict with a suspended sentence permanently on your record. Unless the case against Dario actually results in a conviction substantial enough to prove, formally, that the original evidence against Cesare was fabricated from the ground up. Right now, you're a woman who broke the law to protect a man the state still isn't required to fully exonerate. If Dario goes down for what he actually did, the record changes. Your license review changes. Everything changes. Teodora looked across the room at Cesare, who had gone very still in the way she'd learned meant he was calculating something he didn't want her to see him calculating. You already knew this, she said, before Renata told me. You've been talking to the prosecutor's office. I've been talking to everyone, he said, without apology. I'm not going to let you carry a permanent record for saving my life while my uncle walks free to threaten the next person who gets too close to the truth. That's not a version of this I'm willing to accept. Then let's ask her, Teodora said. Not tell her, not pressure her. Ask her, and let her decide, the same way I decided, with her eyes open, exactly what it might cost. The drive to the farmhouse felt different this time. No longer a clandestine errand conducted under cover of darkness, but an open, cautious visit with two of Cesare's most trusted men trailing a discreet distance behind. A small concession to a danger that hadn't disappeared just because a verdict had been read. Elena was waiting on the porch when they arrived, thinner than Teodora remembered, her dark hair pulled back, an expression on her face that suggested she'd already guessed why they'd come before anyone said a word. You want me to testify? She said. We want to ask you to consider it, Teodora said. Nothing more than that. Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the olive trees that had sheltered her for over a year, the only home she'd had since Dario had first threatened to end her life for finding out about the money he'd been skimming. I've spent 13 months disappearing, she said finally. Do you know what that does to a person? Watching your own name in the news, reading your own obituary, and not being allowed to grieve any of it, because grieving would mean admitting you're still alive to feel it. She looked at Teodora directly. You gave up your career to protect the truth. I've spent over a year hiding from it. I think I'm done running. Elena, Cesare said quietly, if you testify, Dario's people will know exactly where you are, exactly what you look like now, exactly how to find you if this goes wrong. I know. Something steely settled into Elena's expression, the ghost of the woman she must have been before Dario had first threatened her into vanishing. I also know that the only way I ever actually get my life back, my real name, my real face, a future that isn't a farmhouse 2 hours from anywhere, is if he's the one who disappears instead of me. I'm tired of being the reason he stays free. I'd rather be the reason he finally isn't. Teodora reached out and took her hand, feeling the tremor in it, the fear underneath the resolve. Then we'll make sure you're protected every step of the way, she said. I promise you that. It was a promise she meant with everything in her. It was also, she would understand within the week, a promise that neither she nor Cesare had the full power to keep. Because Dario Vitale, cornered for the first time in 40 years, was not a man inclined to wait quietly for a grand jury to decide his fate. Later that night, unable to sleep, Teodora found herself standing at the same window where she had once stood as a suspicious guest, studying a man she believed capable of murder, watching the city lights spread out below with a familiarity that still occasionally startled her. Cesare found her there an hour past midnight, wrapped in one of his sweaters against the chill of the air conditioning, and didn't say anything at first, simply came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You're thinking about Elena," he said. "I'm thinking about how easy it is to ask someone to be brave when the danger isn't actually yours to carry," Teodora admitted. "I keep telling myself I'm not pressuring her, but every time I imagine what it will cost her to testify, I know part of me needs her to do it anyway, because it's the only path left that actually protects both of us. That feels like a kind of selfishness I don't have a comfortable name for yet. It's not selfish to want the people you love to be safe," Cesare said. "It becomes selfish only if you stop being honest with yourself about what you're actually asking and why. You told her the truth today. You let her decide. That's the whole difference between what you're doing and what my family has spent generations doing to people far less willing to fight back." He pressed a kiss to her temple, unhurried. "Whatever she chooses, we'll build the rest of this around her decision, not the other way around." The grand jury room was smaller than Teodora had expected. Windowless, fluorescent lit in a way that made everyone inside look faintly ill. And Elena Conti sat at the centre of it, in a plain grey suit Teodora had helped her choose that morning, her hands folded exactly the way Teodora's own had been folded on a different witness stand 6 months earlier. "State your full name for the record," the assistant U.S. attorney said. "Elena Rosaria Conti," Elena said, and her voice, though quiet, did not shake. "I am, as of this morning, formally alive." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Not laughter exactly, but something close to it. The specific human relief of watching someone reclaim a joke from a tragedy that had nearly consumed her. The attorney, a sharp, patient woman named Ibarra, who had spent 3 weeks preparing Elena for exactly this moment, walked her through the story with careful, deliberate pacing. The embezzlement she'd discovered 11 months before her staged death, the shipping contracts Dario had been quietly siphoning funds from for years, the night he had come to her apartment personally to explain, with chilling calm, that her silence was worth considerably more to him alive than her testimony would ever be worth to anyone else. "He told me I had 2 options," Elena said. "Disappear quietly, with enough money to build a new life somewhere he'd never have to think about me again, or stay and eventually become a liability he'd have no choice but to remove permanently." He was very clear that the second option wasn't a threat. It was, in his words, simply an inevitability, the way weather is an inevitability. "And when you chose to disappear," Ibarra said, "what happened next?" "I thought that was the end of it. I genuinely believed for months that I'd made a survivable trade, my old life for my actual life." Elena's composure wavered just slightly for the first time. "It wasn't until Cesare's people found me, almost by accident, following a financial trail Dario hadn't been careful enough to fully erase, that I understood the truth. Dario had never intended to let me simply disappear. He needed a body. My disappearance created the opportunity. He just needed to convince the world it was a murder instead. And he needed someone to blame for it who wasn't him. And that someone was Cesare Vitale. That someone was always going to be Cesare," Elena said, looking for the first time directly at the jurors rather than at Ibarra. Because removing him legally, publicly, through a murder charge, accomplished something an assassination never could have. It didn't make him a martyr his own people would rally around. It made him a liability the family could respectably abandon. The testimony continued for 3 more hours. The account numbers Elena had memorized before fleeing, the private banker who had helped Dario launder the skimmed funds, the burner phone records that placed Matteo, Dario's son, in direct contact with the private clinic that had supplied the falsified dental records used to identify the wrong woman's body as Elena's own. By the time it ended, even the most skeptical of the 23 jurors in the room had stopped looking at Elena like a curiosity and started looking at her like exactly what she was. The single most dangerous witness Dario Vitale had ever underestimated. Outside in the hallway, Teodora found Elena sitting alone on a bench, staring at her own hands like she wasn't entirely sure they belonged to her. "How do you feel?" Teodora asked, sitting beside her. "Lighter," Elena admitted. "Terrified, but lighter. Like I finally put down something I'd been carrying so long, I forgot it was heavy." She glanced at Teodora sideways. "Is that how it felt for you? On the stand, telling the truth, even though it was going to cost you everything?" "Something like that," Teodora said. "Mostly it just felt like finally being allowed to be honest, after months of holding 2 completely different versions of the truth in my head at the same time. I didn't realize how much that split had been costing me until I stopped doing it."
Elena nodded slowly, and for a moment the 2 women sat together in the fluorescent hallway in a silence that felt, despite everything, almost peaceful. It would not last. 2 floors below, in a lobby full of reporters who had gotten wind of the day's testimony faster than anyone in the prosecutor's office would ever officially admit, a man Teodora didn't recognize was already photographing Elena's face from behind a folded newspaper. Photographs that would, within 6 hours, find their way to an address in the city that belonged, though none of them yet knew it, to Matteo Vitale.
That evening, back at the small apartment Teodora had kept through everything, Elena sat curled on the sofa with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, staring at nothing in particular, and Teodora recognized, with a pathologist's careful attention to the small, telling details other people missed, exactly what exhaustion this deep actually looked like on a person who had spent 13 months holding herself perfectly still to survive. "Do you regret it?" Teodora asked. "Testifying?" "No," Elena said after a long moment. "I regret that it took someone trying to frame an innocent man for my murder before I finally found the courage to stop hiding from my own life." She looked up, something rueful in her expression. "I used to think courage meant not being afraid. I don't think that anymore. I think it just means doing the frightening thing anyway, and letting the fear come along for the ride, instead of waiting for it to leave first."
That sounds like something I'd have told a jury 6 months ago, if I'd had the words for it yet.
"Maybe we taught each other that,"
Elena said, and reached over to squeeze Teodora's hand. 2 women who had each, in their own separate and dangerous ways, chosen the truth over survival and discovered, against all odds, that the choice had ultimately given them both back exactly the lives they'd been afraid they'd lost forever. Cesare had not slept properly in 3 nights by the time he sat down across from Faro in the back room of a restaurant the old man had frequented since before Cesare was born. A small, unremarkable place that had, for 3 generations, quietly hosted exactly the kind of conversations that never happened anywhere with cameras.
"You look like your father did the week before he died," Ferro said, pouring 2 glasses of wine neither of them would finish. Which is to say, like a man trying to solve 6 problems at once and succeeding at none of them. Dario's people photographed Elena outside the courthouse yesterday, Cesare said. I need to know how much time we actually have before he decides testimony alone in a sealed grand jury isn't a threat he can wait out. Ferro's weathered face didn't change, but something in his eyes did. The particular sharpening of a man who had spent 40 years learning to read exactly how much danger a piece of information carried. Less time than you'd like. Dario's finances have been unraveling for months. Elena's testimony about the shipping contracts was only the surface of it. He's been quietly bleeding money into a private ledger for years, buying loyalty from council members, from 2 federal contacts I only recently confirmed, from at least one judge who oversaw an early motion in your own trial. He set down his glass. Your father knew about that ledger, or suspected it, near the end. He never found it. I think, in a strange way, it's the reason he died before he could. You think Dario killed him to protect the ledger? I think your father was 3 months away from forcing a formal financial audit of every council-adjacent account, including Dario's, when his heart supposedly gave out. Ferro's voice had gone flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had buried this particular grief a long time ago, and had no intention of unburying it now, except as a weapon. I think if that ledger exists, and I believe it does, it is the single most dangerous object left in this entire conflict. Dangerous to Dario, because it would end him permanently, and dangerous to us, because whoever finds it first controls exactly how this war ends. Where do we start looking? We don't. Ferro's mouth curved, the first thing resembling humour Cesare had seen from him in weeks. I already have. There's a private banker in Lugano who's handled 2 generations of the family's less official accounts. Discreet man, expensive, loyal to whoever's currently winning. I paid him a visit 3 days ago, before you'd even decided to ask me to. Ferro, your father trusted me to protect this family, the old man said, quiet and unshakable. I don't intend to wait for permission to keep doing that, especially not when the alternative is watching that woman of yours end up in a courtroom for a trial you can't fix with lawyers. He reached into his jacket and set a small, unlabeled drive on the table between them. It's encrypted. I don't have the key. But the banker confirmed its existence, confirmed roughly what it contains, and confirmed that Dario doesn't yet know it's been copied. That buys us time. Not much, but some. Cesare looked at the drive for a long moment, understanding with total clarity exactly what he was holding. The single piece of leverage capable of ending, permanently and legally, the war his uncle had been quietly waging against his family for 4 decades. It should have felt like victory. It felt instead like standing at the edge of something with no clear bottom, aware that whatever came next would cost more than either of them had yet accounted for. Break the encryption, Cesare said. Quietly. And Ferro, whatever this costs, whatever it takes, I need you watching Elena and Teodora both, starting tonight. Dario's cornered. Cornered men don't wait for grand juries. Ferro was already rising, already reaching for his phone, already moving with the specific, unhurried urgency of a man who had spent his entire life anticipating exactly this kind of moment. I know, he said. I started an hour ago. Cesare sat with the drive in his hand for a long time after Ferro left, turning it over between his fingers, feeling the specific weight of a decision he hadn't yet fully made. He thought of his father's careful, unfinished audit, 3 months from completion, when death had interrupted it. A death Cesare had suspected for 2 years and never been able to prove. A grief he had learned to carry quietly, rather than let it consume the careful control his position required. He thought, too, of Teodora, asleep down the hall, unaware yet of exactly how close they might finally be to an answer neither of them had dared hope for. He did not wake her to tell her. Some truths he had learned from her example more than anyone else's deserved to be handled with evidence first, and emotion second. Verified, confirmed, made solid enough to withstand the specific scrutiny she had taught him to respect, before being shared with anyone who would have to carry the weight of hearing them. He set the drive carefully in the office safe and sat alone in the dark a while longer, letting himself feel, just for a moment, the particular ache of a son finally close enough to the truth to almost taste it. Teodora had not stopped thinking about her since the night in the farmhouse, the nameless woman who had died alone in another state, whose body had been transported under cover of a falsified coroner transfer and burned in a warehouse specifically so a killer's frame job could pass an autopsy. She had a face in the case file, a set of dental records, a toxicology report that had never belonged to her. She did not, anywhere in the official record, have her own name. It took Teodora, working quietly through channels she technically no longer had professional authority to use, 6 days to find it. "Marisol Reyes," she said, sitting across from Cesare with a printed obituary from a small newspaper in Nevada spread on the table between them. 31 years old, overdosed alone in a motel room, 11 months before Elena's staged death. No family listed in the obituary except a sister in Reno, who apparently never claimed the remains because the funeral home had already been paid, anonymously, to release them to a private transport service before anyone could ask questions. "Dario's people," Cesare said. "Dario's people bought a dead woman like she was a spare part," Teodora said, and heard the old anger in her own voice, the specific fury that had built an entire career out of refusing to let the dead be treated as anything less than fully, individually human. She had a sister. A whole life no one in that courtroom ever heard about, because the entire case was built around a lie so complete it erased the one real death buried underneath it. "What do you want to do?" "I want to find her sister," Teodora said. "I want her to know the truth, not the sanitized version the prosecution will eventually release, but the real one. That her sister's body was used, without consent, without dignity, as evidence in someone else's murder frame. She deserves that, even if it's a harder truth to carry than the overdose alone would have been." It took another 4 days to locate Marisol's sister, a woman named Dulce who worked double shifts at a hospital in Reno and had spent 11 months believing her sister had simply been cremated by an indifferent county system, too broke and too exhausted from grief to fight for anything more. Teodora flew out herself, alone, without cameras, without lawyers, carrying nothing but the truth and the specific quiet dread of a woman about to reopen a wound she had no right to reopen and every professional obligation to reopen anyway. Dulce listened to the entire explanation in silence, sitting at a kitchen table in an apartment far smaller and far more ordinary than any penthouse Teodora had grown accustomed to in the last 6 months. And when she finally spoke, her voice was rougher than grief alone could account for. "They burned her," she said, "in some warehouse, to frame a man for a murder that never happened, and nobody thought to tell me any of it until you flew out here yourself." "I know it doesn't undo any of it," Teodora said. "I know an explanation isn't the same as justice, but you deserved to know the truth about what happened to her, and I wasn't willing to let that truth stay buried just because it wasn't convenient for anyone's case." Dulce was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph Teodora had brought, the closest thing to a formal identification anyone had ever given Marisol, an acknowledgement, however belated, that she had been a person and not simply a prop. "My sister struggled a long time," she said finally. "I used to be angry at her for it, angry that she made choices that made her easy to use like this, easy to disappear, easy for someone to decide didn't matter enough to check on twice." Her eyes were wet, but her voice had steadied. "I don't want money. I don't want a lawsuit. I want her name in whatever record finally gets written about this. I want people to know Marisol Reyes was a real person before she became somebody else's evidence." "I'll make sure of it," Teodora said, and meant it with the same total conviction that had once made her walk into a courtroom and destroy her own career, rather than let a lie stand uncorrected. She flew home 2 days later with a signed statement, a formal request for correction of the record, and a private, aching resolve that would eventually become the seed of something much larger than a single case. The understanding that justice, in the world she'd been drawn into, was never simply about the living. It was about making sure the dead were never again treated as convenient, disposable, or nameless, no matter how powerful the people who found it easier that way. On the flight home from Reno, Teodora found herself thinking about her own mother, safely oblivious in Bologna, and the particular gift of a childhood spent knowing exactly who loved her and why. She thought about how differently her life might have unfolded if she, like Marisol, had simply been one more person the world found convenient to overlook, and felt, not for the first time, the specific weight of understanding just how much of her own certainty and drive had been built on privileges she had never fully examined until this year forced her to. She drafted the formal request for correction of the record on the plane, hands steady despite the turbulence, each sentence built with the same careful precision she brought to every autopsy report. Facts first, speculation clearly labelled as such, dignity restored through accuracy rather than sentiment. It was, she thought, closing her laptop as the plane began its descent, the truest kind of memorial she knew how to offer anyone. Not a eulogy, but a correction, ensuring that whatever else the world eventually forgot about Marisol Reyes, it would never again be permitted to forget her name. Dario had not survived 4 decades on the losing side of his family's power structure by giving up gracefully, and the emergency council session he called 9 days after the verdict was, Cesare understood the moment he walked into the room, not a defense. It was an ambush. "My nephew," Dario began, standing at the head of a long table, surrounded by 12 of the family's most senior lieutenants, men who had known Cesare since he was a boy and had, until recently, followed him without question, has spent the last 6 months allowing a state pathologist, a woman with direct access to law enforcement, a woman who has now testified before a federal grand jury, into the innermost workings of this family's business. I ask you all, with real grief and not a little fear for what comes next. How many of you believe that decision was made out of love? And how many of you suspect, as I do, that it was made out of a far more dangerous kind of weakness? A murmur moved through the room, and Cesare felt it land exactly the way Dario intended it to, not as an accusation he could easily dismiss, but as a doubt planted carefully among men whose loyalty had always been, at its core, transactional, built on the belief that Cesare's leadership kept them safer and more profitable than the alternative. "I would remind the council," Cesare said, keeping his voice level with an effort that cost him more than he let show, that the woman in question uncovered, at considerable personal cost, a conspiracy engineered by my uncle to fabricate a murder charge against me. She did not weaken this family. She saved its rightful leadership from a coup dressed up as justice. She also, Dario said smoothly, put every man in this room one federal subpoena away from a conversation none of us wants to have. Elena Conti's testimony didn't stay contained to my affairs, Cesare. It touched shipping manifests, banking relationships, arrangements this council has quietly relied on for a decade. Your attachment has cost this family more exposure in 6 months than I managed to cause in 6 years of careful business. It was a masterful reframing, and Cesare watched several of the older lieutenants shift uncomfortably in their seats, weighing genuine loyalty against genuine fear. Exactly the calculation Dario had spent 40 years learning to manipulate. Ferro, seated near the far end of the table, caught Cesare's eye with a small, deliberate shake of his head. "Not yet. Don't play the ledger yet. Let him finish hanging himself first." "You want this council to believe," Cesare said instead, "that the exposure is my fault, rather than the fault of the man who staged a murder using a stolen corpse and framed his own nephew for it." "That's an interesting version of events, Uncle. I'm curious how it survives contact with the actual evidence." "There is no evidence linking me to any of that," Dario said too quickly, and Cesare heard, for the first time in the entire conversation, the faint crack of a man who was no longer entirely certain of his own footing. "Elena Conti's testimony implicates unnamed associates, financial irregularities that predate my involvement in day-to-day operations." "Careful, Uncle," Cesare said quietly. "You're starting to sound like a man rehearsing a defense, rather than a man confident in his innocence." The room went very still. Dario's composure, the practiced warmth he had spent decades perfecting, flickered. Just once, just long enough for 12 lieutenants who had known him for years to see something underneath it that none of them had ever been shown before. It wasn't proof. It wasn't the ledger, still sitting encrypted on a drive in Ferro's careful custody, waiting for the right moment to be deployed with maximum irreversible effect. But it was doubt, finally planted in the one soil where Dario had never expected to have to defend himself. And Cesare understood, walking out of that council session with the vote to remove him from leadership tabled rather than passed, that his uncle's carefully constructed narrative had just begun. For the first time in this entire war, to genuinely crack. Cesare replayed the council session for hours afterward, alone in his office, searching for the exact moment he could have countered Dario's reframing more decisively, and finding each time that patience had genuinely been the only viable strategy, that any more forceful response would have simply confirmed the very narrative his uncle was trying to build, of an heir too emotionally compromised to lead with a clear head. It was a strange, uncomfortable kind of victory, winning by doing almost nothing at all, by trusting that the truth, given enough time and enough rope, would eventually hang the man who'd spent his whole life avoiding exactly that kind of accountability. He called Teodora before midnight, needing more than strategy, simply the sound of her voice. "I let him talk," he told her. "I let the whole room watch him almost convince them I was the problem. And I said almost nothing back." "That doesn't sound like you." "It's not," he admitted. "It's what you would have done. I kept thinking the whole time about how you handled cross-examination. Never defensive, never rattled, just patient enough to let the truth do the work instead of trying to force it." He exhaled, something like relief in the sound. "I think I finally understand why that worked so well for you." Teodora, hearing about the council session second-hand that evening, found herself unexpectedly furious on Cesare's behalf, not at Dario alone, but at an entire system that had spent decades rewarding exactly the kind of manipulation he'd just deployed. "They watched him do that to you," she said, "the same maneuver over and over for years, and they still nearly fell for it." "People believe what's comfortable to believe," Cesare said. "It's easier to imagine a nephew corrupted by love than an uncle who murdered his own brother for power. I don't blame them for wanting the simpler story. I just refuse to let them keep choosing it once the evidence says otherwise. And if the ledger hadn't existed, if Ferro hadn't found it in time, then I'd have found another way," Cesare said, quiet and certain. "I didn't survive 2 years of this war by having only one plan. I survived it by refusing to accept that losing you was ever an acceptable outcome, regardless of which plan actually worked." The council's ultimatum came 4 days later, delivered not by Dario directly, but by 2 senior lieutenants who arrived at Cesare's penthouse with the particular grim formality of men who did not want to be delivering the message they'd been sent to deliver. "The council is prepared to reaffirm your leadership," the elder of the 2 said, a heavy-set man named Bianchi, who had served the family since before Cesare was born. "On one condition. Dr. Marchi's continued relationship with this family is deemed by unanimous vote an unacceptable liability. They're asking you to end it. Formally, publicly, in a way that removes any question of her ongoing access to your affairs." "And if I refuse?" "Then the council will consider your judgment compromised," Bianchi said, not meeting his eyes, "and will move to install alternative leadership, effective immediately." Cesare stood at the window for a long moment after they left, looking out at a city that had never once in his entire life asked him to choose between the 2 halves of himself: the man capable of leading an empire built on fear, and the man his mother had tried to raise before cancer took her, and his father had tried, on his deathbed, to remind him he was still allowed to be. He understood, with total clarity, that this was the test Massimo had warned him about. Not a single dramatic moment of violence, but a quiet, bureaucratic demand to prove his loyalty to power by sacrificing the one person who had taught him in 6 months more about what that power was actually for than 4 decades of lieutenants ever had. He found Teodora in the kitchen and told her everything, watching her face carefully for the particular flinch he half expected and dreaded. "You should take the deal," she said instead, steady, though he could see what it cost her to say it. Formally, publicly, whatever they need to hear. Teodora, let me finish. She set down the mug she'd been holding, crossed the room, and took both his hands. The same gesture he'd used on her once, in the back of a car speeding away from gunfire a lifetime ago. I'm not asking you to actually leave me. I'm asking you to understand that surviving this, really surviving it, long enough to actually change anything, might require you to lie to 12 dangerous men for exactly as long as it takes to find the ledger and end this properly. That's not weakness. That's exactly the kind of strategic patience your father spent 30 years teaching you. And if it's not a lie, if they force a vote and I lose anyway, and the price of refusing costs both of us everything, then we lose it together, she said, and I would still rather lose everything standing next to the man who chose me over an empire than keep everything standing next to a version of you who chose the empire instead. But Cesare, her voice caught just slightly, I don't actually think that's the choice in front of you. I think the choice in front of you is whether you trust me enough to let me help you win this the smart way, instead of the way that gets one or both of us killed, proving a point neither of us needs proven. He was quiet for a long time, turning her hands over in his, tracing the same careful lines he'd traced once across a dinner table in the earliest weeks of everything between them. My father made me promise, he said finally, that I wouldn't let this family turn me into someone incapable of loving anything that wasn't useful to me. I've spent 2 years terrified that keeping that promise meant keeping everyone at a distance. I'm only now understanding it might have meant the opposite. That letting someone close enough to actually change my strategy, instead of just my heart, was the whole point he was trying to make. So what do? We give the council exactly enough to believe they've won, Cesare said, something hardening in his expression that she recognized now as strategy rather than cruelty. While Ferro finishes breaking that encryption. And when the ledger is ready, we don't just remove Dario. We remove every single lieutenant who voted to force this ultimatum. And we rebuild this council with men who understand that loyalty to this family and loyalty to fear were never actually the same thing. That's a much bigger war than the one you're currently fighting. It's the only version of this war, Cesare said, that ends with both of us still standing at the end of it instead of just one. He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers, breathing her in the way he had the very first night he'd let himself want something he couldn't control. Give me 2 weeks. That's all Ferro needs. 2 weeks of letting them believe they've won, and then I promise you, this ends permanently on our terms instead of theirs. 2 weeks, she agreed, and felt, despite everything, the particular steadiness of two people choosing each other with their eyes fully open to exactly how dangerous that choice still was. Later, after Bianchi and his companion had gone, Cesare sat alone for a long while, turning the ultimatum over in his mind, testing it from every angle, the way his father had once taught him to test a contract before signing it. He thought of the 12 men who had voted unanimously to demand Teodora's removal from his life, men he had trusted, some of them, since before he'd ever learned to drive, men whose children he had watched grow up at the same family gatherings that had once felt, however imperfectly, like the closest thing to normal his childhood had offered. He understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that the council's ultimatum was never really about Teodora at all. It was about control. About 12 men discovering, for the first time in Cesare's tenure, that there existed a version of him they could not fully predict or manage, a variable that answered to something other than the family's collective calculus of risk and reward. That frightened them more than any federal investigation ever could, because a leader who loved something more than power was, by their oldest and most cynical logic, a leader who could be manipulated through that love. They were not entirely wrong. He had spent the last week proving them right in exactly the way he needed them to believe, all while building quietly the exact leverage that would make their fear of him irrelevant within a matter of days. The statement Cesare's office released 3 days later was 4 sentences long, cold, and formal enough that it made the evening news within the hour. Mr. Vitale confirms that his personal relationship with Dr. Teodora Marchi has ended. He wishes her well in her ongoing legal proceedings and asks that the media respect both parties' privacy during this transition. There will be no further comment on this matter. Teodora read it twice in the quiet of her own apartment. She had insisted on keeping it, small and unglamorous as it was, precisely because she needed one space in her life that still belonged entirely to her, and felt the particular ache of watching something true get dressed up publicly as a lie. Even knowing it was necessary, even knowing it was, in its own strange way, an act of protection rather than betrayal. Her mother called 40 minutes later, and Teodora let it ring twice before answering, bracing herself. "I saw the news," her mother said without preamble. "Cara, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mama." "You are not fine. I raised you. I know exactly what your fine voice sounds like, and this is not it." A pause, gentler. "Do you want to talk about what actually happened, or do you want me to simply believe whatever careful, sensible thing you're about to tell me instead?" Teodora closed her eyes, feeling 6 months of secrecy press against the inside of her chest, and made a decision she hadn't fully planned to make. "It's complicated, Mama. More complicated than I can explain over the phone. But I need you to trust me when I tell you that the story on the news isn't the real one, and that I need you to let me handle this my own way, even if it looks, from the outside, like I've lost my mind." Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "Your father used to tell people we'd eloped," she said finally, unexpectedly. "Because the truth, that I chose him over a much wealthier, much more sensible match my own mother had already arranged, embarrassed my family enough that we needed a simpler story for a while. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was just a version of the truth small enough for other people to survive hearing." Something warm crept into her voice. "I don't know what you're actually protecting, Teodora, but I know my daughter, and I know she doesn't build careful lies for men who don't deserve the risk. Be careful, and call me the moment you're allowed to tell me the real story." Across the city, in the guarded quiet of his penthouse, Cesare was having a considerably less gentle version of the same conversation with Bianchi and 2 other council members who had come, ostensibly, to confirm the statement's authenticity in person. "You understand," Bianchi said, "that the council will be watching closely. Any indication this separation isn't genuine." "I understand exactly what the council expects," Cesare said, his voice perfectly level, perfectly controlled, the specific coldness he had spent 2 years cultivating for exactly this kind of conversation. I'd remind you, however, that I did not survive the last 6 months by being careless about what I let this council see. Dr. Marchi's involvement in my affairs is over. I'd suggest the council spend its energy on matters that actually threaten this family's stability, rather than continuing to relitigate a decision I've already made. It was, he would reflect later, one of the more convincing performances of his life, a testament in its own dark way to exactly how much he had learned from a lifetime spent separating the two halves of himself, the version capable of ruthless calculation and the version who had, an hour earlier, sent Teodora a single text message that the council would never see. 2 weeks. I meant every word of that, and none of the rest of it. I'll prove it to you, the moment it's safe to. 2 floors below the council meeting, unnoticed by anyone who might have reported it back to Dario, Ferro sat alone in a locked room with the encrypted drive finally, after 11 days of careful work, beginning to yield its secrets. A ledger of names, numbers, and betrayals stretching back nearly a decade, waiting for exactly the right moment to bring the entire architecture of Dario Vitale's ambition crashing down around him. 2 days after the statement's release, a photographer caught Cesare leaving Teodora's apartment building at an hour that made the timing of the separation considerably harder to explain. And for 18 tense hours, both of them braced for the story to unravel entirely before Ferro's work was finished. It was Renata in the end who managed the fallout with characteristic efficiency, releasing a curt follow-up statement noting only that Mr. Vitale had been assisting with the transfer of certain shared property, vague enough to satisfy the tabloid's hunger for a story without confirming anything the council could use against them. That was too close, Teodora said, once the immediate danger had passed. We can't keep improvising explanations every time someone with a camera gets lucky. No, Cesare agreed, which is exactly why the ledger needs to be ready considerably sooner than 2 weeks if we want to survive long enough to stop lying about the one thing in my life I have absolutely no intention of actually giving up. Elena, watching the news coverage unfold from the relative safety of a new apartment Ferro had helped arrange under a temporary alias, found herself oddly protective of Teodora, in a way she hadn't expected to feel towards someone she'd known for only a few months. She called that evening, her voice careful. "I saw the story about the photograph. Are you all right?" "I'm tired of managing a lie," Teodora admitted, "even a necessary one." "I know exactly how that feels," Elena said. "I spent 13 months managing one. It doesn't get easier with practice, no matter what anyone tells you. It just gets more familiar." A pause. "For what it's worth, from someone who's now on the other side of it, it does end eventually. And when it ends, the truth feels even better for having been protected so carefully in the meantime." Matteo Vitale had spent his entire adult life believing his father's confidence in him was a debt he would eventually have to repay in full. And by the 11th day of the council's public standoff with Cesare, he had convinced himself that the moment for repayment had finally arrived. He had watched the photographs he'd commissioned outside the courthouse circulate quietly through channels his father didn't know he still maintained. Private security contacts, men who owed Matteo favors independent of Dario's patronage, the kind of loose, ambitious network a young man builds when he suspects, correctly, that he will eventually need resources his father hasn't approved. He had traced Elena's testimony back to its source with unsettling speed, and had spent 3 days convinced that removing her before the federal case could be formalized was the single most valuable service he could offer his father's crumbling position. He had not told Dario what he was planning. That, more than anything else, would matter later. The fact that Matteo, for the first time in his life, had decided to act entirely on his own initiative, certain that success would finally earn him the respect 4 decades of his father's careful grooming had somehow never quite produced. He chose Teodora instead of Elena in the end, for reasons he would later struggle to fully articulate, even to himself. A calculation that removing the pathologist who had exposed the conspiracy would collapse the entire federal case more efficiently than removing a witness whose testimony was already sealed and circulated. It was, in its own cold way, precise thinking. It was also, he would understand far too late, exactly the kind of underestimation his father had spent 40 years teaching him to make about anyone who wasn't already inside their world. The attempt came on a Tuesday evening in the parking structure beneath the small independent lab Teodora had begun quietly consulting for since her license review began. A place chosen, ironically, because it felt safer, more anonymous, further from the security apparatus that surrounded Cesare's world. She was 3 steps from her car when she heard it. The specific wrongness of footsteps that didn't belong, and turned in time to see a man raising something in his hand that caught the fluorescent light with unmistakable clarity. What happened next took 11 seconds, though Teodora would spend months afterward experiencing it in a slow-motion fragmentation that felt considerably longer. The shout from the stairwell that was Ferro's man, stationed exactly where Cesare's promise to protect her had placed him without her fully knowing it. The impact that sent her sprawling against the concrete rather than into the path of the gun. The single shot that rang out and lodged in a support pillar rather than in her because someone had gotten between her and the barrel a half-second before it fired. She came up, gasping, ears ringing, to find Ferro's man wrestling the shooter to the ground, while a second guard shouted into a radio and understood, with the particular clarity of adrenaline, that she had come within a single half-second of dying in a parking garage because a desperate young man had decided her death would finally earn his father's approval. Cesare arrived 20 minutes later, having broken every speed limit and possibly several laws getting across the city, and found her sitting on the concrete curb, wrapped in a guard's jacket, shaking, alive. Furious rather than frightened in the specific way she processed nearly everything that threatened her. "I'm fine," she said, before he could ask, though her voice betrayed exactly how untrue that was. "Your man saved my life. I'd like to know how you had someone posted at a lab you weren't supposed to know I was consulting for." "I told you 2 weeks ago I wasn't leaving you unprotected," Cesare said, kneeling in front of her, his hands framing her face, with a gentleness that contradicted the fury visible just beneath his composure. "I didn't say I'd tell you exactly how thoroughly I meant it." "Cesare, someone just tried to kill me." "I know." His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with a rage she recognized now, after 6 months, as the specific, controlled fury of a man deciding exactly how much restraint he was still willing to exercise. "And I promise you, on everything I have left to promise with, that the person responsible is about to learn precisely what happens when someone threatens the one thing in this world I actually can't survive losing." They identified the shooter within the hour, a low-level contractor with no formal ties to the Vitale family on paper, but a financial trail that led, after 2 days of careful, quiet tracing by Ferro's people, unmistakably back to a private account belonging to Matteo. Cesare received that confirmation standing exactly where he'd knelt beside Teodora hours earlier, and understood with a cold, settling certainty that the war his uncle's family had been quietly waging against him for 2 years had just crossed a line from which there would be no clean, bloodless way back. In the days that followed the attempt on her life, Teodora found herself unable to fully shake the specific, clinical part of her mind that kept replaying the 11 seconds in the parking garage as though it were someone else's case file. Cataloguing the trajectory of the bullet, the angle of the guard's tackle, the precise sequence of events that had separated her by the narrowest of margins from becoming exactly the kind of body she had spent her entire career examining. She mentioned this hesitantly to Cesare one evening, half expecting him to dismiss it as simple trauma. "That's not strange," he said instead. "That's just how your mind survives something like this, by doing the only thing it actually trusts to make sense of danger. Mine does something similar. I keep running through every version of that parking garage where my men weren't already there, where I hadn't insisted on protection you didn't know about, and none of those versions end anywhere I'm willing to let myself finish imagining." "You can't spend the rest of your life imagining every way I could have died, Cesare." "No," he agreed, quiet and honest. "But I intend to spend a considerable amount of it making sure none of those versions ever get the chance to become real again." Cesare found Matteo alone, 29 years old and considerably less composed than he'd been at any council meeting, in the small, private office his cousin kept above one of the family's legitimate logistics fronts. A space Matteo had always used, Cesare understood now, with a bitterness he hadn't expected, to plan things his father didn't officially know about. "You should have called your men off before I got here," Cesare said, closing the door behind him, alone, unarmed, because whatever happened in the next 10 minutes, he had decided in the car that it would not be decided by anyone's weapon, but his own restraint. "I would have given you exactly as much time as it took to explain yourself. You've now given me considerably less patience than that." Matteo's hand moved instinctively toward the desk drawer before he visibly, deliberately, stopped himself, some last fragment of self-preservation overriding the panic in his eyes. "I didn't mean for her to actually—" "Don't," Cesare said, and something in his voice made Matteo go completely still. "Don't insult both of us by finishing that sentence. You hired a man with a gun to kill the woman I love in a parking garage. There is no version of that sentence that ends anywhere except exactly where you meant it to end. My father would have. Your father didn't order this." It wasn't a question. Cesare had spent 2 days confirming it, tracing the financial trail carefully enough to know, with total certainty, that this particular catastrophe belonged entirely to the son standing in front of him, rather than the father who had spent decades teaching him ambition, without ever quite teaching him judgment. "You did this alone. Which means, cousin, that whatever comes next is a conversation between the two of us and no one else." He watched something break in Matteo's face. Not remorse, not yet, but the specific collapse of a young man realizing too late that he had finally acted entirely on his own for the first time in his life, and had chosen, with catastrophic precision, the exact wrong moment and the exact wrong target to prove himself with. Cesare had imagined this moment 100 different ways in the 2 days since Ferro's confirmation arrived, had imagined, in his darker moments, exactly what his uncle's generation would have done in his position, the swift, permanent, uncomplicated solution that the family's older traditions would have considered not just acceptable, but expected. He stood now in the quiet of Matteo's office, close enough to end this the way 4 decades of Vitale history had always ended conflicts like it, and felt, for the first time in weeks, his father's voice arrive with total clarity in the silence of his own head. Real strength is holding on to whatever's left of your humanity, even when everyone around you insists it's a weakness. "I'm not going to kill you," Cesare said, and watched the words land on Matteo with a shock more profound than any threat could have produced. "Not because you don't deserve it, not because my own family's history wouldn't understand it. Because I made a promise to my father before he died that I would not let this family turn me into someone incapable of choosing anything except the fastest, most brutal answer available to me. You tried to murder the person I love, Matteo, and I am choosing deliberately to let the law finish what you started instead of finishing it myself. You're going to hand me over to the police. I'm going to hand you over to federal prosecutors who are already building a case against your father," Cesare said, "with a financial trail, a confession from the man you hired, and enough corroborating evidence to ensure you spend considerably longer thinking about tonight than you would have if I'd simply ended this the old way." He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at his cousin with something that was almost, despite everything, pity. "I hope, eventually, you understand that I just gave you something your father never once offered either of us, a chance to actually survive your own worst mistake instead of being erased by it." He walked out into the night air feeling, for the first time in 2 years of quiet, grinding war, genuinely lighter. Not because the danger was over, not because Dario's collapse was guaranteed, but because he had just proven to himself, in the one moment that mattered more than any council vote or ledger or courtroom verdict, that his father's dying request had actually taken root somewhere real inside him. He called Teodora from the car. She picked up on the first ring. "It's done," he said. "Matteo's being taken into federal custody within the hour. I didn't touch him." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with something he recognized, with quiet relief, as pride rather than fear. "I know how much that must have cost you," she said. "I'm proud of you, Cesare, more than you probably understand." "I understand exactly how much," he said, "because you're the reason I finally knew what it was worth protecting." Later that week, Cesare sat with Ferro over the details of Matteo's federal handover, going over the evidence package one final time to ensure nothing in it could be construed as coerced or improperly obtained. A level of procedural care that would have been unthinkable in his grandfather's era, and that Ferro, watching him work, found himself quietly, deeply moved by. "Your father used to say," Ferro told him, "that the true test of power wasn't what a man was willing to do to keep it. It was what he was willing to refuse to do, even when refusing cost him something." He set down the folder, studying Cesare for a long moment. "I've watched 3 generations of this family wield power like a weapon. You're the first one I've watched try to wield restraint instead, and actually succeed at making it look like strength rather than hesitation." It doesn't always feel like strength, Cesare admitted. Most days it feels like the harder, slower option, when the easier one is sitting right there, waiting to be taken. That's exactly what makes it strength, Ferreau said, instead of simply the absence of a better idea. Ferreau delivered the fully decrypted contents of the drive on a rainy Thursday morning, laying 17 pages of printed financial records across Cesare's dining table, with the quiet, unceremonious precision of a man who understood exactly how much weight the paper in front of them actually carried. "It's worse than we thought," Ferreau said. "Payments to a state judge who presided over an early evidentiary motion in your trial. Payments to 2 council members who voted 3 days ago to demand the end of your relationship with Dr. Marchi, which means their outrage on behalf of the family's exposure was never principal. It was Dario making sure his own bought votes stayed aligned against you. And this," he tapped a specific page, his expression grim, "this is a wire transfer, 18 months before your father's death, to a private physician who briefly treated Massimo for what was recorded at the time as a minor cardiac irregularity. The same physician who later signed his death certificate." Cesare stared at the page for a long moment, feeling something he'd carried unspoken for 2 years, finally, irrevocably confirmed. "He paid the doctor who killed my father." "The wire transfer alone isn't proof of murder," Ferreau said carefully, "but combined with everything else, the falsified death certificate, the timing, the fact that this same physician retired abruptly to a property in Portugal 4 months after your father's funeral and hasn't practiced medicine since, it's more than enough for federal investigators to reopen the case as a homicide. Which means, Cesare, that your uncle isn't just facing charges for what he did to you and Elena and Dr. Marchi. He's facing charges for what he did to your father." Teodora, seated across the table, had gone very quiet, her pathologist's mind already moving through the specific mechanics of what a reopened homicide investigation into Massimo's death would actually require: exhumation, toxicology analysis on remains 2 years buried, a level of forensic scrutiny that could either finally deliver Cesare the truth he'd been denied for 2 years, or fail to yield anything conclusive at all, reopening a wound with no guarantee of closure. "I can help with that part," she said quietly. "If it comes to it, I know exactly what to look for, and exactly which independent labs won't be compromised by anyone still loyal to Dario." Cesare looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes: gratitude and grief, and the specific ache of a man being offered, after 2 years of uncertainty, a chance to finally know the truth about how his father actually died. "You'd do that? After everything the last exhumation cost you?" "I became a pathologist because I believed the dead deserved someone willing to find out exactly what happened to them, regardless of who it was inconvenient for," Teodora said. "Your father deserves that too, Cesare. And so do you." Ferreau gathered the remaining pages, his expression unreadable in the particular way of a man who had served this family long enough to have buried more grief than he ever let show. "I'll have federal investigators contacted by tonight," he said, discreetly, through channels Dario doesn't monitor. "Once this ledger is in their hands, formally, on the record, there is no version of the next month that ends with your uncle retaining any position in this family, in this business, or outside of federal custody." "And the council members he bought?" "Removed," Ferreau said, with the flat, final certainty of a man who had already begun drafting the list. "Your father spent 30 years trying to build a family that could survive scrutiny. It's time this council finally reflected men who actually deserve to be part of that legacy, rather than men who simply survived being useful to whoever held the most leverage. After Thoreau left, Cesare sat for a long time with the printed pages still spread across the table, and Teodora watched him carry, silently, the specific grief of a son finally holding proof of exactly how his father had died. A grief 2 years delayed, sharpened rather than softened by finally having a name and a face to attach to it. "He's going to pay for this," Cesare said finally, quiet, resolute. "Not the way my grandfather's generation would have made him pay. The way my father would have wanted, in a courtroom, publicly, permanently, with every lie he ever told about this family finally on the record, where no one can pretend not to have seen it." "That's not weakness, Cesare," Teodora said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "That's exactly what strength looks like, when you've actually learned the difference." That night, unable to sleep, Cesare walked alone through the penthouse he'd inherited from a father he now knew, with total certainty, had been murdered for trying to build something better than what he'd been handed. He stopped in front of an old photograph on the study wall. Massimo, younger than Cesare was now, laughing at something just outside the frame, one arm slung around a boy who could only have been Cesare himself at 7 or 8, before any of this had touched either of them. He had spent 2 years grieving a father he believed had simply run out of time. He understood now he was grieving a father who had been actively, deliberately stolen from him. A considerably heavier grief to carry, but also, strangely, a clarifying one. There was no more uncertainty left to manage, no more suspicion to quietly nurse without evidence. There was only the truth, finally solid enough to build something on, and the specific, hard-won resolve of a son determined to finish exactly what that stolen father had started. The federal raid on Dario's estate happened at dawn, 3 weeks after the ledger reached the prosecutor's office, and by the time the sun had fully risen over the city, every major news outlet was running the same story with slightly different framing. Vitale family patriarch arrested on racketeering, fraud, and homicide charges in sweeping federal indictment. Teodora watched the footage from Cesare's penthouse, coffee going cold in her hands, feeling a complicated mixture of vindication and something quieter, sadder. The specific ache of watching an old man in handcuffs being led across a lawn he'd spent 40 years believing was rightfully his, understanding, even now, that his ambition had never been entirely without its own tragic logic. Dario had spent his whole life convinced he'd been wronged by a father's decision made before he was even fully an adult, and had built, decade by decade, an entire architecture of resentment sturdy enough to justify almost anything in service of correcting it. It hadn't made him sympathetic. It had, Teodora thought, made him almost comprehensible, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than simple villainy would have been. "Do you feel anything watching this?" she asked Cesare, who stood beside her at the window, arms crossed, expression carefully unreadable. "Relief," he said after a moment. "Grief, for the family he could have been part of building instead of the one he tried to destroy. And something I didn't expect to feel at all." He was quiet for a long moment. "Pity, I think. He spent 40 years so certain that power was the only inheritance worth fighting for that he never noticed he'd already lost the only thing that actually mattered. A son who might have loved him without needing to prove anything. If Dario had ever once shown him what that kind of love was supposed to look like." The exhumation of Massimo's remains, conducted 3 days later under Teodora's careful, independent oversight, confirmed what the ledger had already suggested: trace levels of a slow-acting cardiac toxin, consistent with prolonged, low-dose administration over several months, entirely inconsistent with the natural cardiac failure the original compromised physician had certified. It was, for Cesare, both the confirmation he had waited 2 years to receive and a grief he had to relearn from the beginning. The specific pain of losing his father twice, once to what he'd believed was simply time and illness, and again, now, to the certainty that it had been murder, patient and deliberate, committed by his own uncle for the sake of an ambition that had, in the end, cost him everything anyway. Dario's trial, when it eventually came, moved faster than Cesare's ever had. The evidence too comprehensive, too meticulously documented by Ferro's careful investigation, to leave much room for the kind of drawn-out uncertainty that had defined the previous 6 months. He was convicted on all counts within 4 months of his arrest, sentenced to what amounted to the remainder of his natural life, and Cesare attended exactly 1 day of the proceedings, the day of sentencing, sitting quietly in the gallery beside Teodora, watching a man who had spent decades trying to destroy him receive, at last, the only kind of ending his ambition had ever actually been building toward. "Do you want to say anything to him?" Teodora asked quietly as the courtroom began to empty. Cesare considered it for a long moment, watching the bailiffs lead his uncle away in handcuffs, an old man, finally, irreversibly stripped of every version of power he'd spent his whole life chasing. "No," he said finally. "I think the only thing left to say to him is something he's never going to be capable of hearing. That none of this had to happen, if he'd simply been willing to build something instead of only ever trying to take it." He turned to Teodora, something settling in his expression that looked, for the first time in months, almost entirely like peace. "I'd rather spend the rest of my life proving that to everyone else who's still watching, instead of wasting another word on a man who's already made his choice." They walked out of the courthouse together, into daylight that felt, for the first time in over a year, genuinely unshadowed by anything either of them had left to fear. In the weeks between Dario's arrest and his trial, Cesare found himself, unexpectedly, visited by his cousin Rosa, the one relative who had never once asked anything of the family's business, who had built a quiet, ordinary life 200 miles away, and had watched the entire saga unfold from a careful, protective distance. "I almost didn't come," she admitted, sitting across from him in the penthouse she'd never once visited before. "I told myself for years that staying away from all of this was how I kept myself safe. Watching what happened to you these last 2 years, I started to wonder if it was really just how I kept myself comfortable instead." She studied him for a long moment. "You look different, Cesare. Lighter somehow, even with everything that's happened." "I finally stopped trying to be only one version of myself," he said. "It turns out that was heavier than I ever let myself notice." Rosa reached across and took his hand, the same easy, unguarded affection she'd offered him as children before either of them had fully understood what separated their 2 lives. "Bring her to visit sometime," she said. "Teodora. I'd like to finally meet the woman who apparently succeeded where 40 years of therapy could never have reached you." He laughed, surprising himself with how easily it came. "I'll bring her," he said. "I think she'd like you considerably more than she likes most of this family." Teodora's own case reopened for review 4 weeks after Dario's conviction. The federal prosecutor's office moving with the particular efficiency of people who no longer had any political incentive to be slow, to formally recognize that the evidence tampering charge had been committed in direct response to a documented, provable criminal conspiracy rather than simple obstruction of justice. The hearing lasted less than an hour. Teodora stood before the same judge who had sentenced her months earlier and listened to him formally vacate her conviction, restore her forensic licensing, pending a standard administrative review, and note, for the record, with the same dry economy he'd shown throughout the original trial, that this court is gratified to see the justice system eventually catch up to conclusions this defendant reached considerably faster, and at considerably greater personal cost, than the institutions meant to protect her. She walked out of the courthouse for the second time in less than a year, and found Cesare waiting exactly where he'd waited the first time, though everything about the moment felt different now, lighter, unshadowed by the specific dread that had coloured every public appearance they'd made together for the better part of a year. "You're free," he said, echoing his own words from months earlier, and this time she let herself believe them completely. "I'm free," she agreed, "and unemployed, and not entirely sure what comes next." "I might have some thoughts about that," Cesare said, "if you're willing to hear them." They walked together through the city rather than taking a car, an ordinary, unremarkable thing that felt, after a year defined by penthouses and courtrooms and careful, calculated appearances, almost startlingly intimate. Two people, simply existing in public without an agenda, without a strategy, without anyone watching to report back to a counsel or a prosecutor. Teodora found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely unsure what her professional future looked like, and discovered, to her own surprise, that the uncertainty felt less like anxiety and more like possibility. "I've been thinking about Marisol," she said as they walked. "About how close her story came to disappearing entirely, buried under everyone else's case. I keep thinking about how many other cases like that exist. Bodies used as evidence in someone else's story, dignity treated as an afterthought, because the case that actually gets prosecuted was never really about the dead person at all." "You want to do something about that?" "I want to build something," she said, testing the shape of the idea as she said it aloud for the first time. "An independent forensic practice, not tied to any single department, not vulnerable to the kind of institutional pressure that let Dario's fabricated evidence sail through review after review without anyone questioning it. A place where families like Dulce's can come when they suspect the official story isn't the whole truth, and get someone willing to actually look." That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that would make you very few friends among the departments that currently control most forensic funding. "I've had a difficult year," Teodora said, with the first genuine laugh he'd heard from her in weeks. "I think I can survive making a few more enemies, if it means never again being the last line of defense against a lie, simply because the truth was inconvenient for the people paying my salary." Cesare was quiet for a moment, something warm and unguarded moving across his face. "I can help fund it," he said, "not as a condition of anything, not in exchange for influence over your cases, ever. I'd sign whatever legal safeguard you needed to make that promise binding. Simply because I believe in exactly what you're trying to build. And because I happen to have access to considerably more capital than any independent forensic practice would normally start with." "That's a generous offer from a man whose family I spent 6 months investigating." "I'm aware of the irony," he said, something almost boyish in his smile. an expression she was still, after everything, learning to recognize as entirely genuine rather than strategic. I'm choosing to consider it evidence of significant personal growth. They stopped walking somewhere near the river, the city's evening light spreading gold across the water in a way that reminded Teodora, unexpectedly, of the very first night she'd stood at Cesare's penthouse window and told herself the tightness in her chest was simply professional caution. It had never, she understood now, been anything of the sort. "I want to build this with you," she said, "not because I need your money, because I want a life that isn't defined by hiding or strategy or pretending in public. I want the version of this where we're not managing a council or a courtroom. I just want us." "You have us," Cesare said, pulling her close, his voice rough with the specific, unguarded tenderness she had only ever seen him offer to her. "You've had that since the very first night I handed you a folder and asked you to look at everything, instead of only what was convenient. I just needed the rest of the world to finally catch up to what I already knew." They found in the weeks that followed her release a strange new rhythm to ordinary life. Grocery shopping without a security detail 2 cars back. Dinners that didn't require a table chosen for its sightlines to every exit. Arguments about nothing more consequential than whose turn it was to do the dishes. Teodora discovered she had almost forgotten what boredom felt like, and was surprised to find she treasured it, this small, unremarkable freedom to simply exist without calculating the next danger. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she admitted one evening, curled against him on a couch neither of them had bothered to make particularly grand or impressive, simply comfortable. "It feels strange, not bracing for it constantly." "That's grief, in its own way," Cesare said. "Grieving the version of yourself that had to stay braced for so long. It takes time to trust that the danger's actually over, even after it is." "Is it over? Really?" "Dario's convicted. Matteo's in federal custody. The council's been rebuilt around people who actually deserve to be there." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I can't promise you nothing dangerous will ever happen to either of us again. I can promise you it won't come from inside our own family anymore. That's the part I actually had the power to fix." She thought, too, of the version of herself who had once believed objectivity meant distance, that caring less made her more trustworthy rather than simply more alone. She had spent 14 years building a career on that mistaken equation. It had taken one dangerous, extraordinary man and one impossible case to finally teach her the difference between detachment and integrity, and to show her that the truest kind of honesty had never required her to stop loving anyone at all. The Marisol Reyes Forensic Institute opened its doors 9 months later, a modest 3-story building on the edge of the city that Teodora had chosen specifically for its distance from both the coroner's office that had once employed her and the gleaming towers that housed the Vitale family's legitimate business operations. A deliberate, symbolic independence from both worlds that had, in different ways, nearly consumed her. Dulce Reyes attended the opening, standing quietly near the back of a small crowd that included Renata, Anselmi, who had, in the months since Teodora's exoneration, become an unexpected and vocal advocate for exactly the kind of institutional reform her ordeal had exposed a need for, and Elena, who had finally, after a year of careful transition, begun rebuilding a life under her own name in a city considerably safer than the one that had once forced her into hiding. "She would have liked this," Dulce said quietly, standing beside Teodora as the ribbon was cut, looking up at the building's simple engraved dedication. In memory of Marisol Reyes and every person whose truth was treated as inconvenient. The dead deserve to be seen accurately. So do the living who love them. I hope so, Teodora said. I think about her more than I probably should for someone I never actually met. That's not a burden, Dulce said. That's exactly what she'd have wanted someone to feel on her behalf. I spent 11 months thinking no one in the world remembered her existed except me. You built her a building. The Institute's first 6 cases, taken on in the months that followed, were exactly the kind of work Teodora had envisioned. Quiet, careful re-examinations of convictions and rulings that had relied too heavily on convenient evidence and not enough on rigorous verification. Cases referred by defense attorneys and skeptical families who had learned, through word of mouth, that the pathologist who'd sacrificed her own career rather than let a lie stand was now willing to do the same work for people who couldn't afford the kind of resources Cesare Vitale commanded. Cesare, for his part, spent those same months completing the restructuring Ferro had begun years earlier, a formal, legal transition of the family's shipping and logistics operations into structures that could withstand exactly the kind of scrutiny that had once threatened to destroy them. A slow, deliberate fulfillment of the promise his father had made him repeat at his deathbed. It was not, he told Teodora more than once, a transformation that happened overnight or without resistance. There were lieutenants who left rather than adapt, business relationships that dissolved once their less legitimate foundations could no longer be quietly maintained. Months of careful, exhausting negotiation with regulators and auditors who had every reason to distrust a name as notorious as his. "Is it worth it?" Teodora asked him one evening, watching him review yet another compliance filing at the kitchen table of the apartment they'd finally, quietly, begun sharing. "Every difficult page of it," he said, without hesitation. "My grandfather built this family on fear, because fear was the only currency he understood. My father spent 30 years trying to change that, and ran out of time before he finished. I'm not interested in running out of time the same way he did." He set down the document, looking at her with the particular warmth that still, after everything, occasionally caught her off guard with its intensity. "I want to build something that outlives both of us, something Dario could never have imagined, precisely because he never once believed strength and legitimacy could coexist." "Your father would be proud of you," Teodora said quietly. "I don't say that lightly. I mean it." "I know," Cesare said. "I feel it some days more than I ever expected to. Like he's still teaching me something, even now, just by having asked the question in the first place." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture that had, over a year and a half, become their private shorthand for everything neither of them needed to say aloud anymore. "I used to think inheriting this family meant inheriting a war. I'm only now understanding it also meant inheriting a chance to finally end one." Not every case that came through the Institute's doors in those early months ended in vindication. Teodora insisted, over the objections of at least one early donor who wanted a cleaner public narrative, that the Institute publish its findings honestly, even when they confirmed an original ruling rather than overturned it. A policy that cost them a handful of sensational headlines, but earned them, within the first year, a reputation for genuine impartiality that no amount of marketing could have purchased. "We're not in the business of proving people innocent," she told her small founding staff, gathered around a table in a conference room, still smelling faintly of fresh paint. We're in the business of proving what's actually true, whichever direction that happens to point. The moment we start choosing outcomes before we've examined the evidence, we've built exactly the kind of institution I spent a year fighting against. There was, too, a quieter kind of work happening alongside the Institute's public cases. The slow, deliberate rebuilding of Teodora's own relationship to the profession that had once defined nearly every hour of her life. She found herself training a small team of junior examiners now, something she had never had the patience or the interest for during her years at the coroner's office, where competition for advancement had made mentorship feel like a luxury rather than an obligation. "You question everything," one of her new hires told her, half in exasperation, after Teodora had sent back a report for the third time in a single week. "Even things that seem obviously correct." "Especially things that seem obviously correct," Teodora said. "Convenience is the enemy of accuracy in this work. I learned that lesson at a cost I'm not eager for any of you to repeat." She softened, seeing the younger woman's frustration. "You'll get faster. You won't get less thorough, not while you work here. That's the one thing I'm not willing to compromise on, no matter how much pressure a case brings with it." It was, she recognized, the exact standard Dr. Fabrizi had once held her to. A torch passed forward now, in a building that bore a dead stranger's name rather than her own, built on the specific conviction that the truth, however inconvenient, was always worth the extra hour it took to find it properly. The council that gathered 18 months after Dario's conviction bore almost no resemblance to the one that had once demanded Cesare abandon Teodora to protect the family's exposure. 5 of the original 12 lieutenants gone, replaced by younger, sharper figures Ferro had spent a year quietly vetting for exactly the qualities Massimo had always valued and Dario had always dismissed as weakness: patience, restraint, the wisdom to know which battles didn't need fighting at all. "You've built something your father would barely recognize," Ferro said, watching from the doorway as Cesare closed a meeting that had, remarkably, lasted less than an hour and produced unanimous agreement on a matter that would once have taken days of manoeuvring and threats to resolve. In a good way, I mean. He always hoped for this, he just never quite believed he'd live to see it. "I couldn't have built it without you," Cesare said. "Or without her." He didn't need to specify who. Ferro's expression softened, the closest thing to open sentiment the old man ever permitted himself. "Your grandmother would have liked her," Ferro said. "Concetta, I mean. I only knew her the last few years of her life, but I remember her telling your father once that the whole family's fate would eventually come down to whether one of you found someone brave enough to actually ask the hard questions instead of accepting whatever answer kept them safest." He shook his head, something like wonder in his weathered face. 50 years later, and it turned out to be true, almost exactly the way she predicted. Cesare found Teodora that evening in the small kitchen of the apartment they'd made properly, permanently theirs in the months since the Institute's opening, a space considerably less grand than the penthouse where everything had begun, chosen deliberately for its warmth rather than its statement. Close enough to the Institute that she could walk to work most mornings. Close enough to what remained of the family's legitimate offices that he could do the same. "You're cooking," he said, leaning in the doorway, watching her move through a kitchen that had, over 18 months, slowly filled with the specific evidence of 2 lives properly merging. Her books stacked beside his ledgers, a single, stubborn houseplant she'd insisted on relocating from her old apartment, despite his gentle teasing that it had clearly earned its independence by now. "Badly," she admitted, glancing at a pan that had seen better days. "Your mother's recipes are considerably harder to execute than you made them sound." He crossed the kitchen, wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin against her shoulder as he studied the half-burnt garlic in the pan, with an expression of exaggerated concern that made her laugh despite herself. "You're supposed to let it burn a little the first few times," he said, echoing words that were not originally his own, passed down now through 2 generations of loss and love and hard-won wisdom. "It teaches you to notice the moment before something actually goes wrong." "Is that what this whole year has been?" she asked, leaning back into him. "Learning to notice things before they go wrong?" "Some of it," he said. "Most of it has just been learning how to actually let someone close enough to notice things about me, instead of managing every version of myself the way I managed everything else." He turned her gently to face him, his expression open in a way that would have been unthinkable to the cold, controlled man who had once sat across an interrogation table, calculating exactly how much truth he could afford to spend. "I used to think love, in my world, was simply a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. I understand now it was the only thing capable of actually protecting anything worth protecting in the first place." "That's a significant philosophical journey for a man who once tried to seduce me with an encrypted folder of evidence." "I contain multitudes," he said, and kissed her, unhurried, certain, the specific tenderness of 2 people who had survived a war together and understood, finally, exactly what they'd built on the other side of it. The pan behind them continued, quietly, to burn. Word of the council's transformation travelled slowly through the family's wider network, and not everyone who heard it approved. A handful of old associates, men who had done business with the Vitale family for decades under Alessandro's and then Massimo's more traditional terms, quietly withdrew their dealings once it became clear that Cesare's new structure meant considerably less tolerance for the kind of arrangements that couldn't survive an auditor's scrutiny. "We're losing revenue," one of the newer council members noted carefully during a quarterly review that Teodora sometimes sat in on now, less as an outsider and more as a trusted advisor whose instincts for spotting inconsistency had proven valuable in contexts well beyond forensic pathology. "We're losing revenue we were never entitled to in the first place," Cesare said. "I'd rather build something smaller and legitimate than something larger and one federal indictment away from collapsing the way my uncle's ambitions eventually did. That's not a philosophy up for debate at this table. It's the foundation everything else here is built on now." The council member nodded, chastened but not resentful, one of the quiet, steady signs accumulating month by month that the family Cesare was building bore less and less resemblance to the one he had inherited, and considerably more resemblance to the one his father had spent 30 years hoping, against the odds, that it might someday become. Cesare thought, watching the meeting break up, of a line his father had once written in the margin of an old ledger discovered years later among his personal papers. "Legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what continues to grow correctly once you are no longer there to tend it." He had not fully understood the sentence when he first found it. He understood it now, watching men who had never met Massimo Vitale nonetheless carry forward exactly the principles he had spent 30 years trying, imperfectly, to instill. They married in the spring, 11 months after Dario's sentencing, in a ceremony so small and so deliberately unremarkable that not a single reporter noticed it happening until the day after, when Ferro, the only witness besides Renata, Elena and Teodora's tearful, delighted mother, quietly confirmed it to a single trusted contact at a local paper, precisely enough to end the speculation, without inviting any spectacle. It was held in the small cottage in the hills where Elena had once hidden for over a year, a place that had, over the past 18 months, become something closer to a shared retreat than a memory of danger. Elena herself insisting, with the particular fierce generosity of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own life, that the location be reimagined entirely as a place of beginnings rather than hiding. "You once asked me," Teodora said, standing across from Cesare beneath the canopy of olive branches that had sheltered considerably darker conversations in the past, what the difference was between being feared and being worth loving. "I don't think I ever actually gave you an answer." "You gave me an answer every single day for the last year and a half," Cesare said. "I was simply too slow to fully understand it until now." "Tell me anyway," she said. "I want to hear you say it." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had spent his entire life being taught one lesson by the world he was born into, and had spent the last 2 years, slowly and at considerable cost, unlearning it in favour of another. "Being feared means people give you what you want because they're afraid of what happens if they don't," he said. "It's efficient, it's reliable in its own cold way. It is also, I've learned, completely hollow. Because everything you get through fear is borrowed, not earned. And the moment your power falters, so does everyone's compliance." His hand found hers, steady, certain. "Being worth loving means someone chooses you, freely, with their eyes open to exactly how dangerous and complicated and imperfect you actually are. Not because they have to, but because some part of them decided you were worth the risk anyway." My grandmother taught my grandfather that difference 50 years before either of us was born. And it took our whole family, 2 generations, and one very stubborn pathologist to actually learn it. That's a very long answer to a fairly simple question. "You asked for the true one," he said, "not the short one." Ferro, watching from a respectful distance, with an expression that might have been the closest thing to unguarded joy anyone had seen from him in decades, caught Teodora's eye and gave her the smallest, warmest nod. An old soldier's silent acknowledgement that whatever came next for this family, it would be built on something considerably sturdier than fear. They exchanged vows as the sun dropped low over the hills, Elena wiping tears she made no attempt to hide, Teodora's mother clutching Renata's arm with the specific, delighted disbelief of a woman who had spent years worrying her daughter would never let anyone close enough to matter, and finally, joyfully, being proven entirely wrong. Later, walking alone together through the olive trees as the small gathering settled into quiet celebration behind them, Teodora rested her head against Cesare's shoulder and felt, for the first time since a folder had first been handed across a coffee table nearly 2 years earlier, the complete and total absence of anything left to fear. "No more trials," she said. "No more counsels. No more evidence to hide." "No more hiding," Cesare agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Just this, just us, and whatever ordinary, extraordinary life we build from here. Somewhere behind them, faint against the evening air, Elena's laughter carried across the hills that had once sheltered her in fear, and now, finally, sheltered something considerably better. A family rebuilt not on power or fear or the desperate hoarding of control, but on the simple, hard-won understanding that the two people at its centre had spent 2 years and immeasurable danger learning to give each other freely. It had never, in the end, really been a story about a crime at all. It had always, from the very first folder handed across a coffee table, been a love story. One that had simply, for a while, needed the world to catch up to it. Her mother pulled her aside during the quiet reception that followed, holding both her hands with the particular fierce tenderness of a mother who had spent years worrying her daughter had built her life too carefully to ever risk this kind of happiness. "I always told you, love finds people who've stopped looking for it in the obvious places," she said. "I didn't expect it to find you in quite this many headlines, Cara, but I'll take it. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything for so long. You told me what you could, when you could." Her mother's eyes were bright with tears she made no effort to hide. "And you married a man who looks at you the way your father used to look at me. Like the whole rest of the room simply stopped existing the moment you walked into it. I don't need to know every detail of how you got here to know you got here right." Teodora hugged her mother tightly, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember the particular relief of a life with nothing left to carefully manage or explain, just the truth, finally entirely her own to share. She thought of Fabrizi often in those months, wishing more than once that her old mentor had lived to see the Institute's doors finally open. She kept his photograph on her office desk, a quiet reminder of exactly whose standards she was still trying every single day to live up to. Cesare, for his part, had begun keeping a small notebook of his own, not a ledger, not a legal document, simply a private record of the ordinary moments that had come to mean the most to him. The first time Teodora fell asleep against his shoulder without flinching. The sound of her laughter the day the Institute's first case closed successfully. The specific, unguarded look on her face the morning she told him quietly that she trusted him completely. It was, he reflected, the closest thing to a diary he had ever kept, and the first document in his adult life that no one but the two of them would ever need to see.